Hey guys, welcome to Module 3, Lecture 2. This is a lecture on consumerism. Last time we talked about sustainable business and um, whether and how much confidence we should put in businesses to solve environmental problems. I think I concluded that that's kind of a mixed story. There are some reasons definitely to believe that businesses can contribute, but at the same time, they're probably unlikely to, on their own, solve the problems that we have. There are, lots of visionaries, but there are far more bad apples, as I said. And so the question is, I think that we need to ask is also, what's the role of the consumer in this story? If we're talking about the economy, and can the economy, which produces most of the environmental problems that we are observing today, if the economy is the problem, can the economy be changed? And the economy consists not only of companies, not only of producers, suppliers, but also consumers, the people who demand the products. So it's supply and demand in the market is basic economics, right? And so the question I think that we can ask is there a path towards greater environmental sustainability through consumerism? And I think I'll tell you already that I think the answer to that is again mixed, but I think it's worth exploring. One of the things that I think that we have to take into consideration is that sometimes, obviously, consumer choices, that is, the demand part of the human economy, are just not ecologically sustainable or socially just. And that clearly consumer behavior, consumer choices that drive, in a sense, a lot of producers will say, well, we give the consumers what they want. We produce products and services that the consumers want. And so, in a sense, a lot of producers would kind of like to put the blame, as it were, on consumers and say, well, the consumers' choice, what the consumers want, isn't up to us. That's up to the consumer. And in that sense, you might be able to say that, well, maybe consumer choices are at the root of much of our environmental problems. I think it's clearly not that simple, by the way. And so I think we can ask a question about consumerism. And in our modern culture, this is something that we're very familiar with, for good or bad, and I think environmentally speaking, in many ways, obviously bad. But it's an important topic to think about because we are all consumers, whether we like it or not. I mean, unless in the news recently, the Unabomber from the 1990s was in the news, and he lived out in a shack in the Montana wilderness with no electricity or any other modern conveniences, and I don't know how he ate. I mean, catching fish or, hunting deer or something, but, living out on his own in the wilderness. There are not very many of us who would be interested or willing to live that lifestyle. And so all of the rest of us, basically, where does our food come from, our clothing, our shelter, our energy, all of those things, we're dependent on the economy. We are consumers in the economy, whether we like it or not. And so this is something very personal, right? It's part of our daily lives every day, right? And one of the obvious questions, and this goes back to the population conversation, is, well, okay, this is the I equals PAT identity, the I equals PAT identity. how much stuff are we consuming and in what parts of the world. Again, this is some photos from an old book, but a very powerful set of photos, I think, where the author somehow got individual families in different parts of the world to put all of their material belongings out in front of their houses and, compare, for example, the United States. I mean, that looks familiar to me, except that if you took the stuff out of my house, in particular the garage, it would be worse than that, I think. Although I don't really know what all is in my garage anymore, but that sort of gives you a sense of how bad the problem is. And there's stuff on top of stuff on top of stuff that's been there for decades that I haven't seen because I can't get to it because there's so much of it. And unfortunately, I think that's a story that's all too familiar to many of us. Compare that to living in the developed countries, in particular in the US. Compare that to India, for example, in this photo. Everybody put all of their stuff out in front of the house, and there you see it. Very different levels of material consumption in different parts of the world, and in our cultures. I'll talk here mainly about the U.S. I think that kind of consumer abundance is not at all untypical. In fact, I think you could say it's part of our culture. And some critics, this is Annie Leonard, a pretty well-known internet activist, created, I think there is a link on our homework page that's optional to Annie Leonard's classic web video called The Story of Stuff. If you haven't seen it, it's not very long. It's very powerful. Take a little bit of time to watch it. It's really good. Anyway, Annie Leonard describes consumerism as a cultural phenomenon. It's sort of part of our ethos, part of our identity, even. And Annie Leonard says defines consumerism as the particular relationship to consumption in which we seek to meet our emotional and social needs through shopping for stuff. And we define and demonstrate our self-worth through the stuff we own. Now, one of the things that's, there are various sorts of challenges with doing an online asynchronous course like this. And one of them is that I look forward in the real-life version of this course to getting sort of the body language and so on from people in the room, students, like you in the room, which I can't get, obviously, through asynchronous online teaching, and get a sense of, well, does this make sense to people? And I ask people to raise their hands or not. And usually I get a lot of people say, yeah, that sounds like, maybe somebody I know or some of my friends or maybe myself, right? I think there are a lot of us, and I wouldn't, take myself out of this either, who define, in a sense, to who we are to some extent by what stuff we have, right? Take a moment if you can and think about yourself and your friends and so on, and think about, is that true? Do we define ourselves through the stuff we have? I think for a lot of us the answer would be yeah. And the problem with that is that makes us, definitely part of the story of the physical environmental problems that we own, that we create, that we're coping with today. In a sense, we have ownership of that problem to the extent that our culture, our sense of self-identity, our sense of social belonging, emotional well-being, and so on, are sort of need to be continuously supplied by more and more stuff. And the video that I assigned for this week called Advertising and the Edge of the Apocalypse, the title tells you pretty much where the filmmaker stands on the issue of consumerism, and in particular advertising. And the author makes this, really powerful. I look forward to hearing your comments on the discussion page about it. The filmmaker, makes this really powerful statement about how we're influenced by advertising to consume stuff that doesn't really make us all that much happier, and in fact might make us less happy, and certainly has devastating ecological consequences. And so, how do we sort of fall, if that's true, how do we fall into that trap, right? And what are the consequences? Well, the consequences, unfortunately, are pretty grim. For example, this is the Chevrolet Suburban 2023 version, gets 14 miles per gallon in the city. My personal opinion, any vehicle nowadays that, facing the kind of climate crisis that we have, vehicles that get 14 miles a gallon in the city, just, unless you have a very specific need, we shouldn't even be making them. Typically, this is called the Suburban, right? Typically, suburban families buy these vehicles, and you have, one or two, 150-pound adults driving around, maybe a couple of 60-pound kids or whatever. In this vehicle, just massive vehicle that's almost like it's designed to produce as much greenhouse gas as possible. And yet, through advertising, there are people who are, sort of come to internalize the idea that this is what they want, this is what they need. That's the goal of advertising, is to make sure there's a product. There's a demand for that product in the marketplace. And over time, what we've seen is that the larger vehicles, larger SUVs, pickups, Jeeps, things like that are really inefficient, have been the most profitable and the fastest growing part. SUVs, pickups, Jeeps, and so on, have been the most profitable part of the auto market, and have been the fastest growing part of the auto market, despite their energy inefficiency. And that means, in a sense, that and how many of us actually need those trucks? A big, heavy vehicle like that? Not very many of us, right? Back up. And the author of the filmmaker of the video Advertising and the Edge of the Apocalypse makes this argument, and it's a very powerful, important argument, that what advertisers seek to do is to stimulate demand for products, precisely because, in the filmmaker's view and a lot of social scientists' view, capitalism in general has a kind of a problem, which is that it's good at producing stuff, really good, incredibly efficient, and in terms of just generating a lot of stuff, incredibly productive. But there's the weakness in the capitalist system is in the demand side, and producers recognized that a long time ago, 100 years ago, and realized that the weak link in the capitalist economy was trying to get people to buy as much stuff as the capitalist economy could produce, what the filmmaker describes as an immense accumulation of commodities. If capitalism produces that stuff, there has to be somebody to consume it, or it doesn't profit anybody. It doesn't profit the companies if they can't sell the stuff. So it's very important in this economic system to stimulate demand, to constantly get people to want more stuff, preferably bigger, more energy-intensive, resource-intensive stuff that produces the highest profits. And there are all kinds of other examples, unfortunately. Plastics are a gigantic problem for the global environment, and produced largely for the same reasons. And actually, the fossil fuel companies have recognized that with global climate change, with the climate crisis, there are going to be limitations on fossil fuel based energy production. I mentioned last time that the renewable energy market is the biggest part of and fastest growing part of the energy economy today. So fossil fuel companies have recognized that there's going to be a slowdown, at least, in the energy consumption part of demand for fossil fuels. And so how else can you use fossil fuels? Well, plastic is a fossil fuel intensive commodity. And at the same time that energy markets seem to be sort of slowing down for fossil fuels, plastic consumption has gone way up. And unfortunately, we see this in the oceans. We see it on land, obviously, littering and so on. But also in particular in the oceans. You may have heard of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. I think there are actually not just one, but I think it's about 5 in different oceans in different parts of the world, where because of ocean currents, floating plastics, it's lighter than water, so it floats. Typically, although it breaks down and creates microplastics which go into the water, and that's a really serious problem. But a lot of it floats to the surface, at the surface, and accumulates in these huge patches in the ocean. And so in a sense you see how the capitalist economy, with its problem of stimulating demand, keeping consumption high, in a sense sort of manifests materially in these garbage patches in the ocean of floating plastic. In a sense, that's the way the fossil fuel economy is trying to keep its demand high, its consumption of fossil fuels high, to keep pace with production. Production of fossil fuels has been, just going up and up, and so you have to find some market. You have to create that market, and this is the advertising for bottled water and so on is familiar to most of us. There are all kinds of companies, including Nestle, one of the world's sort of environmental and social villains when it comes to sort of corporate histories. Nestle has one of the most shameful, I'll just say that. It has a shameful record when it comes to human concerns with human well-being, human health, and environmental concerns. And so you have Nestle and all sorts of other companies out there marketing bottled water, which is actually, here, I'll show you. This is a stainless steel water. This is right on my desk. I didn't stage that for effect. It was just right there. This is my stainless steel water bottle. It can be used an infinite number of times, not thrown out. And the water that's in it comes out of my tap. It's perfectly fine. In fact, that's what's in tap water is what's in most bottled water. So the fact that by the way, the bottled water industry didn't exist when I was a kid. It was created out of like nothing. All of a sudden, everybody was carrying around bottled water in plastic bottles. That's a new market that was created by beverage companies, but also the fossil fuel industries. It was an effort to keep demand for plastics going up and therefore keep demand for fossil fuels going up. Now it's interesting, one of the stories, one of the facets of the story of consumerism that I think we need to be aware of is the question of green consumerism. And just like when we talked about in our conversation about business, and corporate social responsibility and green businesses and so on. And we talked about the problem of greenwashing. You can also talk about the problem of green consumerism and whether it's sort of a real thing or not a real thing. I mean, it's a real thing in that there's a lot of marketing out there for environmentally minded consumers, where you can buy a product that's, in this case, it's got, a green label on it. It's got this sort of leaf logo. Looks, looks very environmentally minded, and that's entirely intentional on the part of the advertising companies that did these logos. And it's not plastic. In fact, if you can read this, and I'm not sure you can, it says it's from renewable resources. It's made with 100%, and I can't read it myself, but I know it's made with 100% corn products, and it's a corn-based alternative to plastic. And for a lot of people, and it's in theory, it's compostable. In practice, it's actually not. I'm going to show you another slide here. This is the same product, Eco Cups. This was actually a photo that I took just spring term, last term, on the University of Oregon campus at the business school. It was a green business conference. And they were having lunch and so on, and I was sort of participating in the conference, but I was actually busy taking pictures of the trash cans because that interested me in some ways more than what was being said at the conference, including the fact that people were throwing out a lot of single-use paper plates, plastics, including this alternative plastic product, the Eco Cup, made out of cornstarch. And it turns out that actually it's not really very compostable. It's called polylactic acid, PLA, products. This is from the company, the Eco Products webpage themselves, are compostable in commercial compost, but unfortunately not in your home compost. So at least, they're honest about that. And it's also not compostable in landfills or in the ocean. And so it basically acts like plastic. And one of the good things, it looks like plastic, but it also has some of the unfortunate characteristics of plastic, which is unless you can take it to a very specialized kind of commercial composting facility, which is hard, right? How many times have you seen a bin like this that says commercial composting products? Well, no, you don't. You see recyclable, and you see landfill, and you see paper and so on, but you don't see a bin that says commercial composting. So there's a real problem of getting this product to those sorts of commercial composting facilities. I would love to know, and I don't, so I'm only going to ask the question, how many of these actually ever get to a commercial composting facility? I would bet it's not very much, because how does the ordinary consumer get that product to the specialized kind of composting facilities necessary to actually compost it? So is it true that it's compostable? Yes. But in practice, it's very likely not going to happen. It's more likely that it's going to end up in a landfill. And here's a catch. Even worse than, in some ways, than ending up in the landfill is if that cup ends up in the plastics recycling, because it looks like plastic, right? In fact, even I looking at it, if it wasn't for the label, I would have no idea that it's not plastic. It's very convincing. So if you looked, actually I should have taken a picture of this, but if you looked in the recycling bins, often you end up seeing these alternative plastics in the plastic recycling bin. That is actually a huge problem because it's not plastic. It's not recyclable in any way as plastic, and in fact, it becomes a contaminant in the in the effort to recycle plastics, which is difficult enough. They don't want contaminating products mixed in with the theoretically recyclable plastics. Makes it even more difficult to recycle the actual plastics that are out there. So just a whole bunch of, and the energy that goes into producing these is actually higher than an actual plastic cup, and so on. There are more dangerous chemicals involved with it, apparently. So I could go down the list, but as you can see, these are not eco-friendly products in a whole bunch of ways, despite what the label says, despite the green label with the leaf logo on it. Yeah, sorry, I know, it's unfortunate. But the people who are using these, they feel kind of good. Oh, okay, I used an eco product. It's not plastic. They felt kind of good about the fact that they were using something that's not plastic, something that's compostable, biodegradable, in theory, and not usually in practice. And in fact, this has actually been documented. Despite polylactic acid's potential as an environmentally friendly material, it seems clear that a great deal of corn packaging, probably the majority of it, will end up in landfills, and there's no evidence that it will break down any faster there than PET or any other form of plastic. PET is a standard kind of plastic for these sorts of products. So there's just no evidence that this is actually much better, and there are a whole bunch of problems with it. You could, give any number of other examples. Eco razors, eco diapers, eco detergent, I don't even know what that is. Contact lens fluid, eco cleaning stuff, eco Coca-Cola that's in a green can, right? Now, you get the idea. I mean, this is, to a large extent, this is straight up greenwashing. And if we're honest with ourselves as consumers, we go, okay, this makes me feel good buying something with a green eco label on it. But I think with any of these products, if you ask the question, where does this stuff actually end up? What's its actual footprint? It's not so clear that it's green. More generally, I want to explore this question about advertising. Again, this is really powerfully explored in the case of the video that I assigned, advertising on the edge of the apocalypse. But I just wanted to mention, advertising is a really powerful force in shaping our lives. Back in the 1950s, advertisers tried to convince consumers that smoking was healthy for them, even though the cigarette industry knew perfectly well that it wasn't, and in fact knew that it caused cancer. And what did they do? They lied. And in fact, they were sued repeatedly for having lied. I mean, I'm not just saying that they lied, because, that's my theory. It was proved over and over in court that the cigarette producers, the tobacco producers, lied consistently. They knew that tobacco is very harmful and very addictive. And one of the more famous, this again sort of predates most of you, I think, but one of the more famous advertising campaigns in the 1980s and 90s was the Joe Camel cigarette advertising campaign. Joe Camel, this is Joe Camel here, whose job it was to sell cigarettes, Camel cigarettes. And specifically, what a lot of people complained about was that those cigarettes were being marketed specifically. I mean, think about the cartoon, this is Joe Camel, a cartoon character. Who would find that sort of engaging and appealing, typically it was teenagers. And the tobacco industry, for the tobacco industry, that was not an accident. The tobacco industry knew very well that adults were increasingly giving up smoking, and that the way they could, in a sense, recruit new smokers to keep demand for their product high was to addict teenagers in particular. And that's one of the reasons that they got sued a lot. And in the late 90s, this campaign was actually closed by the Camel Cigarette Company because they got so much negative feedback for marketing basically to children, to teenagers. And this is sort of counter advertising that was done to try to fight the tobacco companies, the Joe Chemo ads that came out. And Joe died in 1997 at age 23, but that was a pretty long run of advertising, very intentionally, very consciously, very cynically used for 2 decades plus by cigarette manufacturers to stimulate consumer demand in the marketplace for a product that they knew perfectly well killed people, made people sick and killed people. That's a pretty dramatic example. A lot of the other examples of how advertising manipulates us are maybe less dire than that. Makes us consume soap and so on. But it's interesting and important to think about how this is an advertisement for Palmolive soap, and as you can see, it's quite old, from the 40s or something like that. What's interesting about this is that advertisers began to realize, and this is back in the 1920s, as I understand it, advertisers began to recognize that consumers actually, for the most part, aren't all that interested in soap as a product. Like, how exciting can soap actually be? And what advertisers began to realize was that if you can, in a sense, create an image that your product is associated with things that people actually do care about. I mean, frankly, most people don't care all that much about soap, but they do care about things like romance, sensuality, glamour. I mean, look at this couple, sort of this romantic scene, this glamorous lifestyle, and so on. People do care about that. Sexuality sells, right? This is pretty overt, so romance and so, hints of sexuality and so on, not accidental, right? And advertisers realized if you can sort of create this image, this idea that the product is associated with glamour and romance and all of the rest of it, that people might actually buy your product, even though, Palmolive soap is arguably, not much different than any other kind of soap, but it creates an image that it is somehow. And so often what happens is that we're buying stuff in pursuit of, and this is the argument that the filmmaker makes for advertising in The Edge of the Apocalypse, we're buying stuff because of an image that stuff will make us happier and we'll have better romance, and live a glamorous lifestyle, and so on. But it's empty. It's an empty promise. It's not actually going to make us happier. And yet the job of the advertising industry, which is a $629 billion advertising industry, that exists for the sole purpose of creating these sorts of imaginary relationships between, very mundane products and these glamorous lifestyles and so on. And I have an example. It's maybe the most egregious example I've ever run across of how really mundane products, if the advertisers will seek to connect really, really mundane products to things that people actually really want. And Sorry, this is a little bit racy, but that's sort of the point. Advertisers, like I said, figured out a long time ago that sexuality sells. You can sell stuff with sexuality. I'll be honest, it had never occurred to me that you could sell toilet paper by advertising as somehow being sexy. Okay, this is a brand that we don't get here in the US. I guess it's a European brand, but it's toilet paper. Maybe you can tell me, maybe I've missed something that you can do with toilet paper that will improve your sex life. I'm unaware of that, and maybe you don't tell me. Okay, but you can get the idea. I mean, how more ridiculous can you get? So you buy this toilet paper and you'll have a good sex life. That's basically the message, right? It's obviously false, right? It's not true. Buying that product, toilet paper, is not going to give you a better sex life. It's just not. That doesn't stop advertisers from trying to tell you that, and the advertising industry has a lot of research behind it. They're not stupid, and they have a lot of resources, and they do research, and they have determined that that kind of advertising of mundane products through appeals to things that we really care about, like sexuality and romance, glamour, all of the rest of that, really does work. They wouldn't be doing it. They wouldn't be spending a ton of money, and they wouldn't have been doing it for 100+ years if it didn't work. And so, but the whole point is to keep us consuming and desiring stuff that maybe we didn't really want, maybe isn't really making us all that happy. But it's sort of creating these, what I call imaginary appetites for things that arguably we wouldn't have wanted. I honestly, personally, never particularly wanted Palmolive soap as opposed to some other kind of soap. But the whole goal here is to make people want that kind of soap as opposed to some other kind of soap. And unfortunately, you can ask a question about what is this doing to human values, right? This is, unfortunately, a scene that we're all too familiar with. Black Friday at Walmart. I've seen studies done about asking people, would you trample a fellow customer to death to get a discount laptop? And some people, you have to take these sorts of studies, these sorts of public opinion polls for what they're worth, which is usually not very much. But some people actually answer yes. Yes, I would trample a fellow shopper to death to get a discount laptop. You're familiar with the problem. And the problem is the psychologically, in terms of actual human fulfillment. What we know is physical stuff is actually not what this is. Some of you probably took psychology in high school or college, and you're familiar. In which case, you're almost certainly familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the point here is that material stuff is not even close to the highest level of what actually makes people happy, what the real needs that people have. People's real needs, according to Maslow and a lot of other people, involve morality, creativity, spontaneity, social belonging, self-esteem, achievement, and so on. Things that are not physical in nature. And that's the irony of advertising, is that it tries to give you, tries to sell you a sense of meaning, as fulfillment in your life through material products that are way down here at the bottom, cannot give you the things that psychologists and theologians and everybody else who's studied this matter seems to agree about, which is that material stuff isn't what makes us ultimately very happy. It's not what leads to self-actualization or enlightenment or spiritual fulfillment. It just isn't. There's lots of evidence to back this up. And one of the difficulties that we face in sort of reconfiguring our society and our culture to reflect more accurately, what the question of what does make people happy, what does lead to self-fulfillment, self-actualization, and so on, is that our standard measures of social achievement are measured almost exclusively in terms of material economic growth, what's referred to in the economy as gross domestic product, which is simply a measure of how much money is flowing around, GDP, right? And the late Senator Robert F. Kennedy wrote actually quite eloquently on this topic, that the gross national product does not allow for your GDP, gross national product, does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. So this is Robert F. Kennedy, 50, 60 years ago, whatever it was, channeling Abraham Maslow and others who've made this observation that in our pursuit of economic growth, economic expansion, new markets, and consumerism, we've pursued, in a sense, kind of a false goal. And that, should we be surprised that a lot of people, and sociologists, psychologists, and others have demonstrated this quite clearly, that even while we've become materially wealthier than we ever have been before in history, we're actually no more satisfied with our lives than we ever were. And there's very robust evidence to back that up, that as people have become wealthier, they don't necessarily become happier. After a certain point, obviously you need certain material things in life, and people who are very, very poor are going to be unhappy. But beyond a certain level of material and economic wealth, more stuff, more money actually does not make people much happier. This has been shown in all sorts of efforts to try to find some sort of alternative to gross domestic product as sort of a social goal for our economy, our society. Here's it's called the Genuine Progress Indicator, which includes things like negatives, like, are we hurting the environment, as well as positives, like how much stuff are we consuming, and so on. It tries to round out sort of this measure of how we feel, how good in a sense our lives. And obviously there's a lot of subjectivity there, but it's certainly no less sort of arbitrary and subjective than saying that the only thing that matters to people, according to the GDP, is material wealth. According to the GDP and advertisers and politicians that speak endlessly about expanding about the benefits of economic growth, you have to ask the question, economic growth for what? Is that going to make us happier? Some kinds of economic growth, sure, yeah. Some kinds of economic growth, maybe not, right? And keep in mind, what does the expansion of the human economy actually mean in ecological terms? Ecologically, what the expansion of the economy means is that we're using more and more of the world's resources. We'll talk about this in more detail when I talk about ecological economics. But you can think of it this way: if the human economy is this rectangle in the middle here, what economic growth represents is the expansion of the human economy relative to the finite. The economy can keep expanding, but the earth doesn't keep expanding. The amount of finite resources on the planet doesn't expand. It's fixed, right? And the question of, how much economic growth can the global ecosystem sustain is a really important question. And again, we'll come back to this. One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that expansion of the human economy might actually make us less happy, not more happy. And I think there's good reasons to believe that. And yet advertisers keep telling us, if you consume a certain product, this is an old ad campaign by Apple, and it says, think different by, buying our product that's bought by all those other people who think that they are somehow different. I've mentioned last time in talking about, in population lecture, talking about consumer impact, how much stuff people consume, is super ironic that this is an Apple advertisement that invoked simplicity, and Mahatma Gandhi, the independence leader of India, who promoted a non-consumer lifestyle, being used somehow to promote consumption of a material product. It's ironic. And what I would emphasize is that it's not just people like Mahatma Gandhi who've been talking for a long time about the dangers of materialism and consumerism. The ancient Greeks spoke about the importance of what they referred to as the middle way, the midpoint between luxury and deprivation. Remember, people who are very, very poor obviously need to meet their material needs. But excessive affluence is also a problem. And so the Greeks spoke about, trying to find some balance between those. Aristotle, for example, said that unlimited wealth is great poverty. Too much wealth is actually poverty. That's a powerful statement. And then think about Jesus in the Bible. This is the story of the money changers at the temple. And this is actually one of the few times in the biblical account of Jesus that Jesus really kind of loses his cool, right? It's like overthrowing the tables and so on, and telling these merchants at the temple to go away. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables, and he said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers. And so, Jesus here is, in the Bible, you cannot serve both God and money. Matthew again, it would be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. So you don't have to look to other cultures to recognize that there's actually been a long history of thought about the dangers of excessive consumerism, excessive materialism, and this is it's in almost every culture I can think of has come up with similar concerns. In Eastern religion and Buddhism, the Buddha is said to have said that the root of suffering is attachment. The current Dalai Lama writes that people were created to be loved, and things were created to be used. The reason the world is in chaos is because things are being loved and people are being used. This is the Black Friday sale at Walmart, Target in this case, it doesn't matter. People are being used, things are being loved. Everybody from Aristotle to Jesus to the Buddha to the Dalai Lama has talked about this problem exactly. And I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not impossible that we could have a human economy that is stable and it produces as much or more human happiness. And I think one of the big challenges is that consumerism also offers us this sort of mental easy path to solving our environmental problems through making you feel good about the products that you consume. Here I'm talking about electric cars, which I mentioned in the previous video. Actually, I'm a strong supporter of electric vehicles. I think they're an important part of our way forward. But the big problem with this particular car, which by the way, I happen to think that I've driven a Nissan Leaf. They're great cars, actually. The big problem here is the zero emissions logo on the back. They're not zero emissions. It depends. First of all, the batteries have to be produced, and it depends on what sort of energy mix goes to produce the electricity that produces the car. So to say it's zero emissions is both true and deeply misleading at the same time. And yet it gives us this feeling for the consumer. And so you need to ask questions as a consumer about where is our energy coming from? Where's the electricity that powers the electric car coming from? And not stop at just buying this product. And, if necessary, install solar on your house, or, demand that your electric utility provide more alternative energy sources and so on. And if you don't do that, if you just stop at that point of consuming and say, okay, well, I've done my thing for the environment, that's a real problem. If consumers can just buy the green product, whether it's electric car or a corn-based non-plastic plastic cup, and feel, okay, well, I've again done my thing for the environment, throw the cup away, don't think about where your electricity comes from, then it's almost worse than not being a green consumer, right? So I asked this question in the PowerPoint slides. Are green products as green as they claim? Clearly not. And maybe more importantly, and same thing here, maybe green products actually have all sorts of limitations and contradictions built into them. And that begs the question of, can we really sort of shop our way to sustainability? And the answer is with great difficulty, I would say. And I'm going to end up here with one last question about consumerism, which is maybe just the fact that we're focusing so much on green consumerism distracts us from questions of broader scale systemic changes. We, to a large extent, we put a lot of the burden of making the world greener and more sustainable and so on the shoulders of consumers. Now, should consumers be part of the problem of the solutions? Absolutely, no question about it. But is that enough? Should you stop there? Or does that sort of potentially actually undermine the broader systemic changes that many of us believe are needed? I want to show you a video that examines that question. It's a little bit long, but it's very important.
This video is but what can I do? That single question has followed me like a specter ever since I started this YouTube channel over 3 years ago. Often, upon hearing about one of the many terrifying effects of climate change, my mom, my friends, or hundreds of commenters on my videos all ask a simple question. What can we as individuals do about climate change? I also have been seeking the answer to that question, but I also really want to know why we ask this so much. Why is this our burning question about stopping climate change? Today, I'm going to explore the cultural context that has led to our fixation on individually reducing our carbon footprints. A fixation that in many ways has prevented many of us from imagining a way to act collectively instead. As the chaos caused by climate change grows larger year after year, so too do the cries to action. But environmental action seems to have been cleaved into two distinct paths towards stopping and ultimately reversing climate change: personal actions and systemic changes. This tension takes shape most visibly in the back and forth flow of media, where news sources and blogs pour out their top lists for individual cures to climate change that inevitably get shouted down by cries for collective action as the only medicine for our climatic problem. Individual action versus systemic change. That is the binary option supplied to us in our fight to save the world. From the start, the individual option is flawed because it subscribes to an ideology that continues to prolong the problem of climate change. This notion that the solution to such a massive global issue can be solved through individual lifestyle changes like buying an electric car is a culturally specific one, based in neoliberal thought. Championed by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, the hyper-individualistic mentality of neoliberalism pervades our current world. The agenda of neoliberalism is, as journalist Martin Lucas writes, headlined by policies of privatization, deregulation, tax cuts, and free trade deals, all of which de-emphasizes the individual as a citizen able to take collective action, and instead transforms them into a consumer who, as Lucas goes on to write, is more prone to self-reliance than communal interdependence. It's with this lens, then, that we should understand the task of individual action. Because individual action is important, but it's also limited. Focusing on what the individual can do frequently means that we are not asking what the collective can do. When we talk about individual actions, I mean a transformation in lifestyle for those that are financially and physically able to. There are plenty of people in countries like the US, which has one of the highest per capita emissions rates in the world, who have the luxury of embracing market-based individual solutions to climate change. And if you're curious as to what those solutions are, multiple studies have calculated what the most effective lifestyle changes are for someone wanting to reduce their carbon footprint. According to one study by Seth Wines and Kimberly Nicholas, foregoing a car, having fewer children, or embracing a plant-based diet are some of the most effective ways an individual can slash their own carbon footprint. But these individual solutions can be morally and politically wrong-headed, as in the case of using eugenicist arguments to regulate someone's reproductive future, and can also be costly, difficult, or downright impossible, especially for marginalized people. Not using a car is feasible for some people in certain neighborhoods of cities with plentiful public transit, but for many in the disabled community, for example, a car is a necessity to get around. Or if your only options to get to work are a 25-minute drive or a 2-hour transit via public transportation that is often inaccessible, you're more than likely to choose the car. Additionally, cities structurally divest from poor neighborhoods and predominantly non-white communities, so there tends to be less public transits in those areas. So while there are individual environmental solutions, they need to be viewed in a much broader context as short-term harm reduction strategies rather than the cure-all to climate change. These ways of individual change are based on the idea of the individual as the consumer, not as a citizen. There are individual actions, however, that don't rely on a consumer mindset to enact change, like voting for candidates with strong climate action proposals and holding representatives accountable by calling them. As Mary Anais Heglar writes in a Vox article, we need to broaden our definition of personal action beyond what we buy or use. Start by changing your light bulb. But don't stop there. We all too often focus on the individual market-oriented solutions to the answer, attaching virtue to those who compost their food scraps and labeling those that fly on airplanes as sinners. This overemphasis on individual action, Heglar goes on to write, shames people for their everyday activities, things that they can barely avoid doing because of the fossil fuel dependent system they were born into. We are essentially blaming the victim. And by focusing on the individual, we miss the much bigger culprits to the problem of climate change. The 100 companies responsible for 71% of the world's global emissions, and the government policies that allow them to do it. Naomi Klein puts it bluntly in an interview with Channel 4.
If you can't be an activist unless you have already somehow purged your whole life of fossil fuels, then you'll have a movement of 3 people, which is great for the fossil fuel companies. It's an incredibly effective way to repel activists, to make people afraid to participate because they don't want to be called a hypocrite.
In short, individual actions like not driving a car, while important, are akin to throwing a bucket of water onto a burning house. It will quench some flames, but it distracts you from the fact that it will take a lot more than one bucket to stop the inferno destroying your house. This is where collective action comes in. Individual harm reduction strategies need to go hand in hand with broader societal solutions to climate change. We live in a global economy where it's extremely hard to not use fossil fuels, a world filled with terrible choices. If we don't work to change government policies and pressure corporations to transform, then, to steal Heglar's metaphor, we'll just be sweeping leaves on a windy day. With this in mind, it doesn't matter if you drive a car to work or need to use a plastic straw. The key is to galvanize enough public pressure on governments and industries to pass legislation like the Green New Deal, which would transform our economy so you don't have to choose between the environment and making rent at the end of the month. But what does collective action look like in practice? It can be so many things. You could host a letter writing campaign urging a company to strengthen their environmental policies or canvass for strong environmental leaders. It could be holding consciousness raising spaces for people to educate each other and connect over how climate change affects their lives. It can mean gathering together to protest, to hold your elected officials accountable, or blocking the construction of emissions-heavy infrastructure. It means looking at the work that's already being done and joining in. It could even mean creating art installations within your community, forcing local government and industries to be more aggressive on climate issues. The opportunities are endless. Ultimately, the answer to the question, what can I do about climate change, is this. Do what you can individually, like biking to work or air drying your clothes instead of using a machine. But don't stop there, and avoid attaching moral superiority to those actions. The only way we can truly stop climate change is to act less as individuals and more as a collective voice to force emissions-heavy industries to move past the age of carbon and urge our elected officials to represent our voices. Climate action, then, is all about holding 2 truths in mind. We must work to create a better world now through personal actions, while simultaneously striving for a better future together, imagining and then creating the shape of a world without emissions, where you don't have to commit a quote-unquote environmental sin just to get to work.
Okay, so I want to wrap it up. As I talked about earlier in the lecture, marketing tells us to consume our way to a better lifestyle, including green lifestyles. But we've raised these questions about whether even a green lifestyle is going to ultimately lead to a more sustainable world. And I think that it's quite possible that even green consumerism ultimately is not going to lead to a more sustainable world, and it's not going to make us happier, and it may in fact undermine, as the video I just showed you talked about, it may undermine the broader, more systemic changes that we do absolutely need to achieve a real transformation of our economy and society in ways that will make us truly sustainable. One thing that I think in the video I was thinking about was that of course, he's absolutely right that you should do the things that you can do as an individual, and keep an eye, and also at the same time be working for systemic change. What the narrator, I think, could have added to that was what we added just now, which is that there's a real danger that in sort of buying and consuming the narrative that certain products will make us sustainable, that we just stop there altogether, and that pursuing the individual choices of being more sustainable in our daily practices will actually undermine our interest. It'll co-opt or undermine our efforts to achieve more systemic change. So, is consumerism part of the story, including green consumerism? Absolutely. It's a really important topic. Is green consumerism the solution? Doesn't seem likely, except to the extent, unless it's transformed in ways to make it a lot more real. And that's something that we can all do as well as individuals, is call out the greenwashing as we see it, and say, your product says that it's green, but actually here are the problems. Informing ourselves, educating others about those limitations is another thing that you can do in addition to putting pressure on politicians and so on. So that's a lot to think about, and it'll be the topic of our discussion post for this week, discussion page for this week. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts, because again, this is something that all of us are part of. We're familiar with it in our daily lives. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts. See you there.